Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, where we go deep into the week's world news. And with us today is Carla and Robbins, Adjunct Senior Fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations, formerly with the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Carla, great to have you back. Also joining us, Peter Spiegel, who is the U.S. editor of the Financial Times. Peter, great to have you.
Ivo, thanks for having me again.
And James Harding joining us for the first time, editor and co-founder of Tortoise Media. Wonderful to have you, James. Well, lots of things to talk about. Peter, let's start with you. The U.S. passed 3,000 COVID deaths this week. Europe is at 4,500 COVID deaths a day. Cases are multiplying by the hundreds of thousands and millions per week. That's the bad news. The good news is a vaccine seems to be on the way. How is this all playing out in terms of the vaccines? Who's there first? We know that Bahraini started early on, and what does it really mean for how we're going to be dealing with this pandemic?
Well, I want to focus a bit on the term that's come into vogue, which is vaccine nationalism, and it came out originally when we saw a lot of the various sort of governments, particularly in advanced countries, forcing their domestic companies to sort of focus on their own countries, and to some extent that is an early advantage to the United States because Pfizer and Moderna, which are the two earliest vaccines, are American, but it really kind of reared its ugly head again in the last week because of James Harding's Fair Country. The Brits have, because of Brexit, largely tried to portray the fact that they were first in line as a victory for Brexit. You know, their regulators are separated from the EU, but it really rather surprising spat broke out between Gavin Williamson, who is the education secretary, who went on TV saying, "Well, the reason we got it first is we're just the best country. We're better than France and America." And then surprisingly, you got Anthony Fauci, who sort of weighed in and decided to punch back and say, you know, the Brits are going too fast. They're not as good as the FDA. So it hopefully does not foresage what is going to happen in the future, but I do worry about it for a couple of reasons. One, you know, because right now it seems that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are the only ones out there. Pfizer and Moderna, because of the sophistication of the vaccine itself and the newness, I guess, of the technology, are only able to really make tens of millions as opposed to hundreds of millions very quickly, which means there's going to be a limited supply. So if we're getting into the place where various countries need to secure various numbers of vaccines, most of the non-developed world, the developing world, is going to be shut out. Even the U.S., to a certain extent, anyway, we've learned in the recent days that basically the Trump administration, Operation Warp Speed, took a pass on the Pfizer vaccine because it thought there were other options out there that were going to come to market more quickly. And so this idea that everyone's got to fight for vaccines on an international basis, that does not bode well for the equitable spread of vaccines, particularly in the developing world. But I also point out one other danger to this, which gets at the other vaccine, which we thought was going to be first in line, which was the Oxford vaccine that they partnered with AstraZeneca. And we've seen some reporting coming out now that, again, that vaccine nationalism was part of the reason why we may be still months away from AstraZeneca vaccine. What happened originally was, again, this is actually an Oxford-developed vaccine. They looked to partner with a major global pharmaceutical company, and they were looking at companies, many of which apparently were American, that were expert in vaccines. But the British government pushed them towards AstraZeneca, a British, or at least half-British company, which actually didn't have a huge amount of experience in vaccines. And so look what happened. They looked like they kind of screwed up their phase 3 tests. It looks like it's going to be delayed everywhere. The U.S. now hasn't even restarted its phase 3 tests. So that was the one that is cheap, plentiful, you know, could be manufactured in the hundreds of millions. So the lesson you hear from scientists and people who follow these kinds of things a long time is you need, you know, like any other sort of global supply chain, you need your best and brightest to be cooperating to bring these things to market. And the reason that nationalism is so dangerous is you don't have that now. You have various national companies playing by themselves for their national governments. Sanofi is another example, which have just today announced that they've had some setbacks. That was the one that the French had obviously seized on. So my hope is that this doesn't become an issue. And again, some scientists we've talked to have said that they're less worried about this. They're more worried about so much anti-vaccine sentiment out there that people won't actually get in the queue, as opposed to countries cutting the queue. But if it is, we're here in February, March, only two companies out there with a vaccine are Moderna and Pfizer. And with the difficulty of manufacturing and distributing, I worry that we're going to start getting, national fights, even between allies, over who's going to get these vaccines and whose population gets out of this pandemic first.
James, how is it playing out in the UK? And do you see this vaccine nationalism as a major problem in the way in the relationship with Europe? Of course, we'll get to Brexit in a minute, but also other countries are playing the vaccine nationalism as well. The Chinese, of course, are running around the world and saying we're first. The UAE has just approved the Chinese vaccine. The Russians are out there saying we've got a vaccine that works. Unfortunately, hasn't been tested as much. Is this the new way, the geopolitics of vaccination? Is that how we should think about it? And is Britain trying to find its global role by being first?
So Ivo, annoyingly, I have to say, I think Peter is basically right on all things.
It's hard to admit, I know, yes.
For me, I should just say one thing. I really enjoyed Peter reference to the United Kingdom as James Harding's fair country. I should tell your listeners, Ivo, that when Peter and I worked together at the FT, Peter's accent had certainly drifted more British, not quite Prince Charles. But
that is a libel. That is a libel.
But here's the thing. I think that in the UK we're seeing vaccine nationalism, and Peter's totally right to call it out, in four ways. Right, two of them make a joke of our politics, but are not particularly worrying. Right? So there was a discussion about branding the Astra-Oxford vaccine boxes with a Union Jack. Right, this may seem slightly Noel Coward movie to you, but it's a kind of measure of our politics. And then there have been the things that Peter mentioned, our Education Secretary Gavin Williamson claiming that it's because the UK is the best country in the world. More worrying is it's another example of lies passing as statements in politics, in which the UK claimed that because we were leaving the EU, we could get vaccine approval sooner than other EU countries, which is just untrue. That said, those two things I think are not particularly problematic. Right? The two areas of vaccine nationalism that I think are really deeply problematic are around confidence and distribution. So the root of vaccine nationalism is not just kind of little England flag waving. It does have a root in the fact that all of the great rushes for supplies in the response to this pandemic have run into problems of global supply chains. And often they run into problems of China. And the response has been what some people call resilience, and other people just say, let's do it ourselves. And so on two fronts, what you've seen is countries saying we can do this ourselves. Hence, as Peter said, let's get Oxford University partnered up with Astra rather than necessarily another international pharmaceutical company. But the problem you've got is confidence, because what you've seen is the Pfizer, BioNTech and Moderna trials come out. AstraZeneca and Oxford came out with a very muddled statement about the efficacy of its vaccine. That's led to real questions of confidence. You've now got a transatlantic spat in that the New York Times in particular has led the reporting saying, look at the way Oxford and Astra screwed up its discussions with the FDA and the delay to its approvals as a result. And that will feed questions of confidence and trust in the whole vaccine program. And then there's a second issue, which is, Peter said at the end there, there are real questions whether or not we're going to have sufficient vaccines, even for distribution between allies. Well, forget allies. This is a global problem. And, without being too cute about either, the Council on Foreign Relations or your outfit, Ivo, the reality is we found that we are discovering what it's like to operate in a world without global coordination and leadership. And what you're going to see, if you don't watch out in 2021, is mass distribution of vaccines in the wealthier nations and very, very partial distribution, if at all, in the poorer nations. And this is going to be a political problem of our making in the 2020s. So I do think that Peter's totally right to put his finger on vaccine nationalism. It's a real issue. It's a reason why you need your kind of Chicago councils on foreign affairs and your CFRs to try and address it.
That's great, James. Carla, you're muted. jump in here. Of course, Trump, who claims that all the vaccination is as a result of his personal leadership and investment of Operation Warp Speed. Let me emphasize that Operation Warp Speed is a major contributor to getting the vaccines out there as quickly as we have. But he had an event earlier this week and signed an executive order putting America first on vaccines. That is, Americans have to be vaccinated before anybody else. How does that play, do you think?
Well, you know, the Brits may say we're number one, and the United States, Trump says he's number one. So that's basically the Trumpian way. You know, it's interesting. There's so little discussion about this in the United States, in part because I think most Americans have the impression that there will be an infinite number of vaccines available. Trump has been so triumphalist about this, claiming a great success. And you balance it out with the fact of the skepticism about vaccines. If anything, maybe there may be more vaccines available than people are willing to take, which I think is a fundamental concern. And perhaps, as Peter was saying and James was saying, the spat that's going on here will add to that fear. You know, in the nearer term, I think there's really a fundamental problem here beyond the issue of equity. You know, as we've seen with this pandemic, it doesn't know borders. And if we don't figure out how to help other countries in the developing world to get access to money and access to vaccines in a reasonably short period of time, you know, this disease is not going to be contained. We are going to eventually open our borders and people are going to be traveling. And we saw how it spread in the first place. And we can vaccinate a reasonable number of people within our borders itself. Not everybody's going to get vaccinated. And we have to think about this beyond an equity issue. We have to think about this as a health security issue as well. You know, money is going to have to go somewhere. Now, Biden has committed, and as you've written so well about this, Ivo, this week, Biden has committed to rejoining the World Health Organization, to having all sorts of pandemic advisory councils globally, but he hasn't committed to joining, you know, the global effort of distributing vaccines and financing vaccines. We're waiting for him to do it. And I don't know if it is because Trump has raised this America First idea that Americans have to be vaccinated first. And he hasn't spread the word out there that we have to do this globally because it is a global problem.
I just said to jump in there, and James talked about the geopolitical implications of not vaccinating the developing world, and Carla just mentioned the health risk. Being the Financial Times guy, I got to say, I'd be slightly crass about it. There is also economic impact here, right? I mean, much of the global growth has come from the developing world over the last decade, and I think Rand had a report out that they said it would be a $1.5 trillion hit to the global GDP if we left the developing world without sufficiently vaccinated. So, you know, we see it. I think those of us, we've all been stuck inside for months and months and months. We're eager to get a vaccine, but we have to realize it is in our own political, health, and economic interest to make sure there's equitable distribution globally of the vaccine. And I just fear, that, as James said, that this vaccine nationalism will prevent that from happening.
James, before going to breakfast, jump in here quickly.
Can I say one thing? I think there is also a really interesting and testing question for us about investment and returns in vaccine development. And because of the noise of the politics, we're actually unable to hear the substance of the question. And it's a really difficult one. If you know, I mean, I joke with Peter about having worked together, but the truth is, you know, we spent the better part of a decade together in the FT at a time where first the financial crisis, then the, you know, technology revolution, and then, if you like, waves of populism and nationalism tested the FT's worldview and that free markets view. There's something creeping up on us here, which is about global healthcare architecture and rules, which is also really testing, because in the urgency of the pandemic right at the start, you were hearing lots of different things. We're going to make a marginal profit, or we're going to make no profit, or we're going to share our IP with everyone. The reality is now there's a real lack of clarity, and there's a lack, to be fair, of clarity from the top of those corporations, but also within politics, about how we make sure that these pharmaceutical companies make sufficient returns that they can continue to invest. You know, we haven't even begun to address the possibility of mutations of this virus, right? So this is a long-running vaccine program. It's not a 2021 program, it's a 2020s program. How do you make those businesses sustainable? But what is considered to be a justifiable and legitimate level of profit from a global pandemic. And I just think, and I just put it just in response, Peter, when you said it's an economic issue, there's a big financial question here as well, which I think is really ticklish.
Can I just add one fun thing? I don't need to get into Brexit, but there's also an international institution issue here as well, which is for a very long time, people trusted the WHO. And for a very long time, people trusted the CDC in the United States as well to be the surrogate, and to be even more trustworthy than the WHO. You know, the World Bank is raising the alarm about this. The IMF is raising the alarm about this. No one is listening to international institutions. They're not even listening to the CDC for good reason about this. Who is going to be the arbiter on safety? Who is going to raise the concern about what's going on in the developing world? Who's going to pick up the pieces afterwards? Biden can talk about rejoining the WHO. There is such fundamental skepticism about global institutions at this point, fed by 4 years of Trump, fed by the failure of the financial crisis and all. There has to be, you can't deal with problems like this unless there is a global effort there, and there have to be institutions. If you go on the side of the bank and the fund, they're saying the right things about this. No one is listening right now.
No, I think that's a real problem. I'll end on this by saying that, you know, although the pandemic and everything we've seen in vaccines have created pushes for nationalism and pushes for deglobalization in some ways, this particular vaccine was created by 2 Turkish immigrants working in a German lab, produced by an American company, manufactured in the first instance in Belgium, and approved first in Bahrain, Britain, and Canada, which shows that the world is still pretty integrated. By the way, Pfizer headed up by a Greek CEO. So there is a degree of globalization of internationalism, and of course the science behind all of this is open to everyone, and the scientists are talking to each other, and they don't know any borders, etc. It's how do you get the global science to work with the national politics that we all face. Which may be a good segue, James, to talking about national politics, about the weirdest national politics, at least if you're not living in Britain or the European Union, that we saw, or the drama that is now 4.5 years running on Brexit is it seems, coming to an end, one form or another, in the next 3 weeks after a dramatic dinner in Brussels with the European Council President and the Prime Minister of Britain. Where do you think we are today? Where will we be in the end of the week? And most importantly, what's going to happen on January 1st?
Well, my worry on this, Ivo, is that not since Monty Python have we shown you guys such a good time. So, basically, we are showing to you that there was a crisis. Sorry, what was that, Carla?
Bring out your dead.
I'm not dead yet.
there was just to let you know, there was a crisis in the UK for a while during, I would say, peak Seinfeld, when we thought that we'd lost the gift of comedy and the United States was going to dominate the humor business. Well, I just want you to know we're back. Our gift for farce is look, I think the thing that's extraordinary about this is the level and scale of misunderstanding. So even if we'd had this conversation 2 to 3 weeks ago, the markets would have told you, and the sort of savvy players in Westminster would have told you, it's 80-20 likely that there'll be a deal, right? Today, it's 80-20 there won't be a deal. Right? It's not done, but it's very close. And it's very close that we're not going to get a deal, partly for reasons of process, we're getting timed out, but fundamentally because we have had, I'll give you a kind of high and low explanation for it. The low explanation is that we, the UK, have never really fronted up with ourselves or the European Union about what we wanted. And the reality is that we're getting divorced. And for a while, we talked about a divorce as a move out of the marital bed and into either, you know, single beds or separate bedrooms, but some idea that we would be living in the same house. But in the end, it's clear to the Brits, and the sort of revealed preference, if you like, of the Conservative Party is, no, we'd rather move into our dingy little flat and start life again, right? And even if that's going to be tough, the benefits of those freedoms means that we believe we're going to be able to start our life again, right? The reason why I say there's some really profound misunderstandings is that the Europeans basically worked on the premise that we are willing to give you access to our markets if you observe a certain set of understandings, not rules, but understandings about the way those markets work. And if you breach those, we're going to have some resolution mechanism, right? So let's not be distracted by fish. Fish is not the issue. The issue here is fundamentally around divergence, i.e., can the UK government regulate to create competitive industries or invest to create competitive industries? And when the UK and the EU disagrees about those things, is there a resolution mechanism? Now, in the end, what's been revealed to the British as much by the British is that they are not willing to accept even those forms of words. And that's come as a surprise to the Europeans, who, much like Remainers, thought, well, when push comes to shove, the Brits are going to want to have some kind of economic settlement that works. But at the moment, the primacy of freedom of action is what dominates Boris Johnson's thinking. And so unless he is willing to do a U-turn in the next 72 hours and say to his cabinet, and it's not so much the Brexiteers, but it's his cabinet, actually, I've calculated that I'm going to have to swallow a certain amount of consultation and a window of convergence with the EU in order to have the benefits of access. I think we leave without a deal. And I think that, again, the politics of this are really uncertain in terms of the EU, but they're also very uncertain in the UK, because for my lifetime, for 25 years, governments have essentially worked to coordinate with other countries to enable trade, because they've made the calculation that's the biggest driver of economic prosperity. In this instance, Boris Johnson and his government are saying, no, it's not market access, it's market interventions, i.e. regulation and investment, that are going to be the things that drive prosperity and innovation in the UK. And it's a fundamentally different set of principles about the role of government and the economy. And it is, frankly, unproven.
So
Ivo, if I could just jump in here, because being an American who spent much of his career in James Harding's dingy little flat, I have developed a little cottage industry talking about Britain in the world and Brexit. It is striking to me that this is happening just as Joe Biden's going to become the United States, because there's an assumption, I think, in Britain, but in the world more generally, that, okay, return to normalcy, this is going to be good for the special relationship. But the fact of the matter is, this really complicates things. I mean, in some ways, Trump was the ultimate pro-Brexiter, and the U.S. foreign policy establishment has been very anti-Brexit for various reasons. I mean, the U.S. saw Britain as the sort of the Trojan horse of the EU, so it's basically the U.S. representative of the European Council. But more importantly, I think we forget that Joe Biden self-identifies as an Irish American. There is a whole lot of Irish Americans, 17% I looked up the other day of people in Delaware consider themselves Irish Americans, a lot of Irish Americans in Pennsylvania and other big important states. And he has made very clear that if there's a hard Brexit, which is in some definitions a breach the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland and the Republic, the U.S. is not going to play ball on a bilateral trade deal. And you've seen that not only Biden himself, but you've also heard it from members of Congress, Nancy Pelosi being the most prominent. And so this whole sense that Brexit was going to usher in an age of global Britain, most important allies, which are its NATO allies in the continent of Europe and its most important military ally in the U.S., are sort of really neuralgically opposed to anything that is going on right in terms of a no-deal Brexit. I'll also just point out there's a lot of rumors going on in Washington that Biden's pick for the ambassador to the Republic of Ireland is going to be Chris Dodd, who is quite possibly his closest friend when he was in the Senate. So you're going to have a guy in Dublin able to pick up the phone to the President of the United States to say, let me tell you what perfidy Britain and Albion has done yet again. I mean, this is not really good vibes for an income prime minister who other than Bibi Netanyahu, probably hitched his ride to the Trump administration more than any other ally. And I think you're going to hear a lot of sort of, it's going to be a lot. It's not going to be as easy, I think, as believe this return to the special relationship if there is a hard Brexit in the next couple of days.
Carla, jump in here and perhaps also comment on the other part of James. So one was the issue of how is economic growth derived and what's the role of government in it. The other is this question of sovereignty, this idea that we are now defining sovereignty as complete and total control of what happens in our borders, when we live in a world in which that may never have been the case. The last time it was the case to the 19th century, if it was the case, but it certainly isn't the case in the 21st century, as the biggest thing that happened in 2020 shows, we're all getting sick by a global disease. So how does this play, and this nationalism that we talked about in the vaccine issue is now sort of coming forward in this way as well?
Two things. One is, I don't think the first lesson people to come away from the pandemic is engage more in the world. I think people are going to think supply chains, we couldn't get our PPE because the Chinese cut us off. It was better when we closed the borders down. And you're not hearing, as much as you're hearing from Biden that America's back, you're also hearing from, we got to rebuild our factories. He's got a very 20th century definition of what American wealth is. And he's talking about bringing factories back home too. Not as much as Trump was, but you're hearing a lot of that from, to Scranton Joe. On the Peter thing, I agree with Peter to a great extent, as much as it pains me as well. James, Peter and I worked at the same places, just not at the, but I'm not completely sure that, how much of that was a bargaining position. And I'd like an excuse. I mean, Johnson did say that it was going to maintain the Good Friday Accord. He didn't want to have a hard border. If there's a hard Brexit, is there going to be the border? Is that going to be a hard border? Because I think that's really the issue for the Congress and for Biden. As long as if there's not a hard border and the Good Friday Accords, are maintained, I think the default position for the U.S. is always going to be the special relationship, because even if they're not the Trojan horse within the EU, you still got NATO. There's an incredible warmth there. And because he is an internationalist ultimately, and let's face it, we all speak the same language. And so I really think that he's going to want to have that relationship there, as long as they don't mess up the Good Friday Accord. So that's my question for you guys. Is that, was that Johnson's last concession there? And is he going to pull it back if it all collapses?
James, you don't mind me hopping in first on this. Just 2 quick points. One, regardless of whether Johnson commits to the Good Friday Agreement, if there's a hard Brexit, there has to be a hard border or some form of a hard border. There are 2 jurisdictions that are different now. There is Britain and there's the EU. The whole point, what made the Good Friday Agreement work is both the UK and Ireland were in the EU, and therefore there could be all sorts of cross-border trade. There may be a limited hardness to the border, but there'll have to be some border there, which I think is inevitable. Can I make one more point, though, on this issue of UK standing within the US? Yes, there is traditional ties. We speak the same language, and the US military and intelligence communities work very closely together. But I was in Brussels when the Ukraine crisis happened, and it was striking to me that Victoria Nuland came to Brussels, and we had a small, she was the head of Europe at the State Department at the time, and we had a small sort of group to talk about what the EU was doing going forward. And remember, it was around the time of the Snowden revelations, and the Germans had to kick out a CIA station chief because there was a mole in the defense ministry. And she was very worried about the Germans' view of the US. And I remember her asking this small group, do you think that's all Merkel has to do is kick out this CIA station chief? And one of the Germans in the group said, yes, she knows she needs the Americans on Ukraine. And her answer was, yes, that she's absolutely right. We need Germany. Germany needs us. France is weak and Britain is distracted. And for an American diplomat to say that Britain does not matter, because it did not matter in the Ukraine crisis, the most serious conflict in Europe, I would argue, in the post-war era, tells you a lot of what has happened about Britain in the world right now. The U.S. does not look to Britain for leadership in Europe anymore. It looks to Germany. And when Joe Biden comes in and needs to deal on Belarus or anything like this, they are going to go to Berlin or Brussels. They're not going to go to London. And I think that's a significant change that's going to happen over the course of the Biden presidency.
That was Germany under Merkel. Let's see.
Well, let's see. I guess the question always is, was it Merkel or was it Germany? Germany is still the dominant economic power in Europe and diplomatic power within the EU. And I don't think that is necessarily going to change, but you're right. A lot of it is tied to Merkel, the person.
So,
can I just do a quick,
yeah.
Ivo, you were about to say something, forgive me.
No. Go ahead. I was going to switch topics. So
Okay. Well, just 3 quick comebacks on this. I think that Peter's point about Chris Dodd, if it is Chris Dodd, is massively interesting. One of the very strange things about Westminster and British politics is you can find more people who can talk in that, annoyingly pompous way that politicians and journalists talk about politics, with that kind of inside knowledge tone about Pennsylvania and Ohio and Florida. You can't find them talking about that in that way about Dublin politics in Westminster. right? It is amazing, right, how little we understand Ireland, right, or try to understand Ireland, right? And the truth is, I would be amazed if 10% of British MPs knew who Britain's ambassador was to Ireland. If it's Chris Dodd, that is a massive statement. And it speaks to something, and I hope we'll get to this, which is, you know, the who's who of this administration, right? Because when we wake up, when we look across the Atlantic, I think we think, okay, Biden wakes up and says Dublin, Tony Blinken wakes up and says Paris, Jake Sullivan wakes up and says Tehran, no one wakes up and says London, right? And that's the way it looks to us, even though it's the kind of administration that the UK has been used to dealing with. I think something really significant's happened there. I would just make a nod, Ivo, to your point about the irony, bitter irony of this argument about sovereignty, because we are going to tip December 2020 into 2021. And in the UK, the organizing political events of 2021 are going to be the G7, right? Truth is, most people don't care about the G7, but I think that you're going to see Boris Johnson move towards this idea of the D10, you know, these 10 democracies, and see if they can bring in India and Australia and South Korea and have 10 democracies meeting. Well, that's then a set of principles around rule of law. But the real organizing principle of 2021 in UK politics is going to be the COP26 in Glasgow. And the only agenda item is taking the targets that were set in Paris and turning them into binding commitments in Glasgow. Right. And the irony that we are a rah-rah sovereignty nation in December 2020 and a let's all hang together and create, you know, legally binding commitments where we pool we recognize our shared commitment to the planet in legally binding terms, right, is an irony that's going to creep up on us.
And I think great point, James, right there, and a good transition, Carla, to the team, which Biden has been put together. We now have almost all of the big players on the foreign and national security field. We don't have a CIA director yet, or a named at least, or an attorney general who plays importantly, though, in a different way in these kinds of issues. Who are these people? What can we take from the choices that he made and not made when he put this team together? So
can I start with what the Chinese would refer to as speaking bitterness, just for a teeny bit to begin with? So in our pre-meeting, I'm not sure if Peter was here a few weeks ago, we were discussing this in our group, and we were talking about whether it would be Michelle Flournoy at Defense and Susan Rice at State. So this was quite a few weeks ago. And one of our guests here suggested it couldn't possibly be both Susan Rice and Michelle. Couldn't possibly have two women in the power ministries. And I got, shall we say, rather snippy, because no one ever says you couldn't possibly have men in the power ministries. So I'm still feeling pretty snippy. And there are a lot of women, who in this world who are feeling really damn snippy right now, because it's neither Susan Rice at State nor Michelle Flournoy at Defense. Now, Susan Rice got the consolation prize. She's doing domestic policy. It shows you how close she is to Biden. And yes, Michelle Flournoy and Biden were never on the same page because of the Afghanistan surge. But, Michelle Flournoy was a major mentor to women in national security. And the fact that she didn't get the job is a source of extreme disappointment. So that's out of the way there. So who are all the guys who are going to be running national security? It's an interesting team. I mean, the choice of General Retired CENTCOM Commander, and the first African-American to be, the head of the Defense Department is a really interesting choice when you consider how many people of color are in the military. Although, to be perfectly frank, this is supposed to be a civilian job. All the people of color in the military respond to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. That's where, to my mind, you can be dealing with that issue. And there is a pretty big debate. And Biden did something very unusual. He wrote an op-ed in The Atlantic arguing the case for Lloyd Austin, making the case, a person of color, of how tight he is with him, how he presided over the withdrawal from Iraq, signaling something very interesting about what is important to Biden right there. But I think he has to get a waiver from Congress because he's only 4 years out. And the 1947 law says you've got to be 7 years out. I think that's an issue. I think he'll get him. But it's a group. Now, who are these groups? They're liberal internationalists. Are they liberal interventionists? I don't think Biden is. You said it before, James said it, what do these people care about? They care about reviving the Iran deal. Are they going to be able to revive the Iran deal? We will see. They certainly care about restoring international institutions. Do they care more about rebuilding at home? Probably. Is it going to be Obama 3? I think they're going to be more focused at home, but Obama was pretty focused at home. I think the biggest questions more than anything else is how assertive are they going to be about China and Russia? And we can talk more about that, I think. And they're going to be tested really, really early on both of those fronts. Those are probably the biggest questions. I don't think it will be Obama 3, in part because, and this is sort of the paradoxical thing about them, Jake Sullivan, the new National Security Advisor, and Tony Blinken, the new putative Secretary of State, have both said they regret that they were not more assertive in the Obama administration toward China, that they regret that they didn't take a more forceful role on Syria. Certainly on Syria, Biden is not an interventionist, so I don't really know how that fits in. On China, how can you do with things at home if you want to extend that far abroad? So I'm not exactly sure how it plays out. Russia's certainly in our face right now, and Biden's going to have to make big decisions on both those fronts.
Carla, if I have you agree with me, I hate to do this, but I want to disagree with you on a couple points on this one. One, don't forget Janet Yellen. She does get the power ministry. She is Treasury Secretary. So, but on the issue of
why am I not comforted by that, Peter?
Well, I mean, I think Janet Yellen actually. I think the thing I was pointing out about Blinken, I think we've seen. I think in the Yellen and Blinken nominations, I was frankly a bit. I don't want to say excited is the wrong word. I think both of them are real interesting intellects. Janet Yellen, people forget, was pretty far on the left wing of economics earlier in her career. She was the first one to really talk about the importance of maintaining a labor market, first one to talk about the racial inequalities in economics. And so I think people see her as sort of a slightly dowdy former Fed chairman. But actually, if you read her her work intellectually, she's really progressive and really interesting. And I think she could be a real force as Treasury Secretary. I also, where I would disagree on Blinken is I think actually Blinken is a liberal internationalist. And I think if you the interesting thing to me will be what you got at, which is they so need to focus on the domestic that does Blinken, a guy who wrote an op-ed piece with Robert Kagan of all people, one of the most leading neoconservatives of Washington, who clearly views his history as his family of Holocaust survivors, views the American role as a defender of the downtrodden and the oppressed, and they've been very vocal recently about Hong Kong. Jake Sullivan's been tweeting about Hong Kong and nothing else. Belarus, there is a democracy movement right now in Belarus, which I would be surprised if Tony Blinken doesn't stand up and voice it. So I'm going to be watching very closely to whether the Biden is Obama 3.0. My bet is not, because of Obama was not a liberal internationalist, and I think Biden comes from that Dean Acheson kind of tradition of the Democratic Party. The last thing I will say is Lloyd Austin, because this is to me the biggest surprise. And again, not to be unkind, but I think if you were asked the Army about the greatest 4 stars of his generation, Lloyd Austin would not be on the top 10 list. What it says to me about Joe Biden is he is pulling together I think it was the New York Times had this phrase, not a team of rival, but a team of buddies. Now, we can criticize Biden for being unambitious in that regard. He just wants people he's comfortable with around him. But I guess the charitable way of looking at this is he's got one job and one job only, which is coronavirus. He is inheriting an economy, that is suffering. He's inheriting a country that is dying. And right now, he just needs to make sure that his cabinet is not fighting with each other. So if I pick a guy who I know I'm comfortable with, not only because he was friends with me when I was vice president, but knew my son, that I think says a lot about how he's compiled his. Blinken has known him since he was in the Senate. Jake Sullivan, he knows from the Obama administration. What it says to me is he is actually going to focus like laser on the domestic and cannot afford a big bust up within his cabinet. And that's why he goes with a guy like Lloyd Austin rather than someone like a Flournoy, who he doesn't necessarily see eye to eye with ideologically, Jay Johnson, who he doesn't know quite as well.
I think you're right, but let me just say one thing here, Peter, which is the interesting thing where the tension exists. He's very comfortable with, Tony's been with him forever. He's very comfortable with these people, but as you said, they are not necessarily in the same spot with Biden on a lot of things. And
True.
that's really ultimately where the tension is going to be.
So, James, a perspective from Europe. If you look at the team, let me put one footnote to what Carla and Peter said, which is, yes, it's a team of buddies, but he's just thrown in 2 hand grenades. One is he's taken a former national security advisor, should have been Secretary of State, and put her in the White House, and he's taken a former Secretary of State and put them in the National Security Council so that's Susan Rice and John Kerry, who are not known as wallflowers, who can be pretty darn disruptive when it comes to making policy.
So I'm really glad you mentioned that Susan Rice thing. Almost every time that we have a family occasion, there's a moment at about 10 to 1 at lunch where I say, oh, we've forgotten to lay the seat for so-and-so, and we're going to have to move everyone around and get us. And when Susan Rice's name cropped up, I was like, pardon me? Did they forget her in the, so I don't think, and I'm sure that's not the case. And if I was Susan Rice, I'd probably think, well, for my own personal political credentials, this is terrific to get that kind of domestic agenda alongside what I'm doing in foreign policy terms. On Kerry, I'd make one point, which is interesting to me. I was on a call with him a few weeks ago, and I was really struck by something about his posture towards China, because a lot of us have been banking on climate as being the bridge back to a meaningful conversation with China. And I was really struck, you'll have heard him more recently than I had, but this was about 3-4 weeks ago, just before he got appointed as this climate czar, talking about the extent to which the US is going to, pick up where Trump left off, the issue of China exporting its coal problem along the Belt and Road, and the extent to which those coal-fired power stations are being financed by China, and now internationalized. So that's interesting tonally. And as you say, it speaks to that point, Ivo, about John Kerry and I suppose Susan Rice being willing to sort of speak across the piece. I can't tell you my observations is I'm nowhere near as plugged in as Carla or Peter or frankly you, Ivo, in terms of these personalities. The thing that's odd is there's relief at the end of Trump among those people who've worked in the international capitals, but there's very little excitement. And the reason that there's very little excitement is they're not revved up by the personality of Biden, right? They worry that Biden is in different ways, partly by age, but partly by personality, going to be a wannabe president rather than a president who's willing to lead. And I thought, incidentally, that Atlantic article was interesting in that context. But there's also, I suppose, the sense that if the president is not going to be strong, there's not clearly a vision amongst that team, even if they're a team of buddies. And it feels as though they're a team of foreign policy professionals, but not necessarily having that vision. And that leaves me with the conclusion that certainly in the next year to 2 years, foreign policy in the United States is going to be determined by reaction to events. And so what I think is happening is you'll see it tested in Saudi, it tested in Turkey, you're going to see it tested, as Carla says, in Russia, and I think tested not just in Hong Kong, but around Taiwan as well. So it's going to be pretty tense.
Well, all those tests will be discussed when they come, if they come, here every Friday. World Review, another wonderful discussion. James Harding, Peter Spiegel, Carla Robbins, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks everyone for joining us online. And we hope to see you next week. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Ivo.